Ha! You hear that? That's not laughter. That's the sound of a world that tried to erase you and failed. They said it would break you. They said you'd collapse. They said humanity would never be the same again. And they were right about one thing. Humanity isn't the same anymore. Because you survived the sickness that broke humanity. While the world panicked. While fear infected minds faster than any virus. While hope was quarantined and courage was on life support. You were still breathing. Still fighting. Still standing. Isn't that funny? The system thought it was the hero. The fear thought it was the villain. But plot twist, you weren't a victim in the story. You were training. Every sleepless night. Training. Every tear. Training. Every moment you thought you'd lose everything. Training. They thought the sickness was the end of humanity, but it was the beginning of your evolution. Because now, you're not just surviving. You're not just recovering. You're not just getting back to normal. Normal is dead, and what crawled out of the ashes. You, stronger, colder, sharper, unbreakable. They survived the pandemic. But you became the final boss. And the world that once scared you. Now it's the level you're about to conquer. Hey, let's play. They called it the collapse of systems, the collapse of certainty, the collapse of humanity itself. Streets went silent. Doors closed. Faces disappeared behind masks and fear. The air felt heavy with numbers, headlines, sirens, and uncertainty. People didn't just lose routines, they lost illusions. Illusions of control. Illusions of permanence. Illusions that tomorrow was guaranteed. And in the middle of that unraveling world, when hope felt like a rumor and strength felt borrowed, you were still breathing. You remember the isolation, the stillness that wasn't peaceful but suffocating, the endless scrolling, the messages that started with, "Did you hear?" The nights when sleep refused to come because your mind was rehearsing worst case scenarios like a broken record. You remember checking in on people, pretending to be strong while silently wondering if you were strong enough. You remember adapting without applause, adjusting without instruction manuals, enduring without certainty of reward. The collapse wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional, spiritual. It tested patience, relationships, faith, resilience. It exposed cracks in systems and cracks in people. Some bonds broke, some dreams paused, some plans evaporated overnight. The future that once looked structured suddenly looked foggy. And yet, in that fog, you kept moving. Maybe not at full speed, maybe not with confidence, but you moved. You learned how fragile normal really was, how quickly comfort can vanish, how silence can be louder than chaos. But you also learned something more dangerous. You learned that you can survive discomfort. You learned that you can function in uncertainty. You learned that even when the world feels unstable, your heartbeat can still stay steady. While others waited for rescue, you built endurance. While fear spread faster than logic, you trained your mind not to drown in it. You discovered parts of yourself you didn't know existed. Patience you never practiced before. Strength you never had to measure before. Creativity in confinement. Discipline in disorder. Courage without witnesses. You survived the conversations about loss. The empty chairs. The canceled plans. The distance from people you once saw every day. You survived the mental battles that nobody posted about. The quiet tears. The private breakdowns. The moments where giving up would have been easier than getting up. And yet, you got up. The collapse stripped away distractions. It forced reflection. It forced confrontation with yourself. Who are you when the noise disappears? Who are you when the applause stops? Who are you when the world is uncertain and nobody can promise safety? You answered those questions not with words, but with endurance. You adjusted to new rules, new rhythms, new realities. You became flexible when rigidity would have broken you. You learned that strength isn't loud. Sometimes it's just consistent. It's waking up when motivation is gone. It's choosing hope when statistics say otherwise. It's continuing when clarity is absent. And the most ironic part, you didn't realize you were transforming. You thought you were just surviving, just getting through another day, just making it to tomorrow. But survival under pressure is not passive. It forges something. Every anxious breath you controlled strengthened your mind. Every uncertain day you navigated sharpened your resilience. Every moment you endured rewired your tolerance for adversity. The collapse tried to redefine humanity as fragile, as divided, as broken. But you became proof that endurance lives deeper than fear. You became evidence that pressure reveals power. You walked through a season that exposed weakness in institutions, leaders, economies. And still, your spirit adapted. You don't look at challenges the same way anymore. You don't panic at uncertainty the same way anymore. You don't assume stability the same way anymore. You understand now that comfort is temporary, but capability can be permanent. That chaos can be a classroom. That survival is not small. It's foundational. The world cracked. Systems trembled. Certainty shattered. And in the middle of that collapse, you did not disappear. You did not dissolve. You did not surrender your will to continue. You absorbed the shock. You endured the weight. You evolved quietly. You survived the collapse. And survival under collapse is not weakness. It is proof of capacity. It wasn't just a sickness that spread across cities and continents. It was fear. Invisible, contagious, mutating faster than facts. It slipped into conversations, into headlines, into living rooms. It infected thoughts before it ever touched bodies. It turned neighbors into threats and uncertainty into paranoia. It whispered worst-case scenarios into every quiet moment and made imagination feel like prophecy. Fear didn't knock on the door. It barged in. It sat at the table. It took control of the remote and replayed the same alarming images over and over again. Numbers climbed, rumors multiplied, opinions clashed, and somewhere between information and misinformation, fear found fertile ground. It grew inside minds, convincing people that safety was impossible, and that hope was naive. You felt it. Of course you did. Your chest tightened. Your thoughts raced. Every cough sounded suspicious. Every headline felt personal. Fear tried to convince you that you were powerless, that the world was spinning too fast to regain balance, that the future had already decided against you. It tried to shrink your courage, to dim your optimism, to make survival feel accidental rather than intentional. But here's the twist. Fear was louder than the actual threat, louder than logic. Louder than patience. It magnified uncertainty until it looked like doom. It made temporary circumstances feel permanent. It convinced strong people that they were fragile. It convinced resilient people that they were exhausted beyond repair. Fear isolated more than walls ever could. It made people suspicious of touch, of proximity, of connection. It rewired routines and turned simple acts into calculated risks. It blurred the line between caution and panic. And the longer it stayed, the more it tried to define reality itself. Yet something inside you began to recognize its pattern. You noticed how fear thrives on repetition, how it feeds on attention, how it grows stronger the more you rehearse it. You saw how easily it manipulates perception, how it can turn a challenge into a catastrophe with a single exaggerated thought. And slowly, you started separating facts from feelings. That didn't mean you ignored danger. It meant you refused to let fear be your leader. You gathered information without drowning in it. You protected yourself without imprisoning your spirit. You acknowledged uncertainty without surrendering your stability. You realized that fear is a signal, not a master. There were moments it almost won. Moments when doubt felt heavier than confidence. When the future looked like a locked door with no key. But each time fear tried to dominate, you questioned it. You asked whether it was warning you or just overwhelming you. You challenged its authority over your decisions. Fear wanted control. It wanted you frozen, hesitant, paralyzed. Because when you stop moving, fear feels powerful. But every small action you took, every routine you maintained, every goal you adjusted instead of abandoned, was rebellion. It was proof that fear does not get the final say. You discovered that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's movement despite it. It's choosing rationality over rumor, discipline over panic, focus over frenzy. Fear tried to convince humanity that it was defenseless. But you learned that awareness and adaptability are forms of defense too. The real virus wasn't just biological. It was psychological. It spread through repetition and reaction. It thrived in uncertainty and division. But unlike a physical illness, this one could be weakened by perspective, by critical thinking, by steady breathing in chaotic moments, by refusing to let imagination outrun reality. And when you look back, you see it clearly now. Fear was everywhere, but it was not invincible. It screamed loudly, but it did not define you. It surrounded you, but it did not own you. You faced it daily, sometimes shakily, sometimes confidently, but consistently. You learned how to feel fear without becoming it, how to acknowledge risk without surrendering resilience, how to protect yourself without abandoning hope. And in doing so, you proved something powerful. Fear may spread quickly, but a disciplined mind spreads strength even faster. Fear didn't arrive with symptoms you could measure. It didn't show up on medical charts or laboratory reports. It moved through conversations, through glowing screens, through the tone of a voice on the other end of a call. It traveled faster than any airplane, faster than any announcement, because it didn't need transportation. It needed attention. And once it had it, it multiplied. At first, it felt reasonable. Caution is natural when uncertainty rises. Awareness is necessary when danger exists. But fear doesn't like to stay reasonable. It exaggerates. It dramatizes. It takes a possibility and paints it as inevitability. It takes a precaution and stretches it into paralysis. It turns, be careful, into, be terrified. You saw how quickly minds changed. Calm people became restless. Optimistic people became cynical. Strong voices became shaky. Fear seeped into language. Every sentence heavy, every prediction dark. It wasn't just about staying safe anymore. It was about expecting the worst. And when enough people expect the worst, it begins to feel normal. Fear loves repetition. The same headlines, the same statistics, the same alarming images replayed until they carve grooves into your thoughts. It conditions reactions. A notification sound becomes a trigger. A simple cough becomes a threat. Silence becomes suspicious. It convinces you that hypervigilance is the only way to survive. But something inside you started observing it instead of obeying it. You noticed how your body reacted before your mind even processed information. The quickened pulse, the shallow breath, the tension in your shoulders. Fear was trying to program you for constant alert, and constant alert is exhausting. You realize that fear unchecked steals more than peace. It steals clarity. Decisions made in panic rarely serve long-term strength. When fear dominates, logic shrinks, perspective narrows. You begin to see only danger, not possibility, only risk, not resilience, only loss, not adaptation. There were moments when it almost convinced you that growth was impossible in chaos. That ambition should be postponed indefinitely. That dreaming was irresponsible. Fear whispered that survival was the highest goal, and nothing beyond it mattered. It tried to reduce your world to the size of your anxiety. But you started asking questions. Is this thought based on fact or assumption? Is this reaction proportionate or exaggerated? Is this caution helping me or trapping me? And those questions created space. Space between stimulus and response. space where strength could return. You didn't deny reality. You respected it. You followed guidelines. You adapted behavior. But you refused to let fear define your identity. You refused to become a permanent state of alarm. You chose discipline over hysteria. Information over rumor. Preparation over panic. Fear wanted control over your imagination. It wanted every future scenario to look dark. But imagination can work both ways. You began picturing resilience, recovery, innovation born from crisis. You reminded yourself that humanity has faced disruption before and rebuilt stronger. History became evidence against hopelessness. You saw how fear divided people, but you also saw how courage connected them. Acts of kindness, messages of support, creativity emerging from confinement. Fear tried to dominate the narrative, yet resilience kept interrupting it. Quietly, consistently. Each day you managed your thoughts. Instead of letting them manage you, fear lost ground. Each time you chose a constructive action instead of spiraling into worst-case thinking, you weakened its grip. You understood that fear is automatic, but surrender is optional. The real battle wasn't only external, it was internal. It was about who would lead your decisions, panic or principle, reaction or reason. And every time you steadied your breath, filtered information carefully, and moved forward despite uncertainty, you proved that fear may be contagious, but so is composure. Normal used to feel permanent. Wake up, follow routine, make plans weeks ahead, assume tomorrow would look like today with minor adjustments. There was comfort in predictability. Comfort in knowing where you would be, who you would see, what you would expect. Normal felt like a guarantee, like a silent contract between you and the world that stability would remain untouched. Then it vanished. Not gradually, not politely. It disappeared almost overnight. Routines collapsed. Calendars emptied. Habits that once defined your identity suddenly became irrelevant. The places you frequented closed their doors. The plans you carefully designed dissolved without apology. What you once called ordinary became inaccessible. At first, you waited for it to come back. You told yourself this was temporary, a pause, a brief interruption before life resumed its familiar rhythm. You held on to old expectations, hoping reality would bend back into its previous shape. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the realization settled in. Normal wasn't returning in the form you remembered. That realization was unsettling. Without normal, you felt untethered. Human beings rely on structure more than they admit. Structure provides identity. It tells you who you are through what you do. Remove it, and you're left asking deeper questions. If you're not your routine, then who are you? If your plans can vanish overnight, what truly defines you? Normal had been comfortable, but it had also been limiting. It kept you operating within known boundaries. It encouraged repetition. It rewarded predictability. When it disappeared, you were forced into adaptation. You had to create new systems, new schedules, new definitions of productivity and purpose. There was discomfort in that transition. Change without choice feels invasive. It exposes how much control you actually have. You couldn't rely on autopilot anymore. You had to think intentionally about how to spend your time, how to maintain relationships, how to protect your mental stability. Every action required awareness. But in losing normal, you gained perspective. You saw how fragile assumptions are, how easily convenience can be mistaken for permanence. You realized that stability is not something you inherit. It's something you build continuously. External systems can support you, but they cannot guarantee you. You also recognized how much of normal you tolerated without question. Habits that drained you, environments that limited you, expectations you carried because they were familiar, not because they were meaningful. When everything reset, you had the rare opportunity to choose deliberately instead of defaulting automatically. Adaptation became your new baseline. You learned flexibility. You stopped expecting life to follow a fixed script. Instead of clinging to how things were, you began focusing on how you could respond. That shift changed your mindset. You moved from dependency on conditions to ownership of reactions. The death of normal forced creativity. You found new ways to connect, to work, to grow. You discovered skills you never prioritized before. You adjusted goals instead of abandoning them. You built resilience not by returning to old systems, but by navigating unfamiliar ones. There was grief in letting normal go. Familiarity carries emotional weight. But there was also freedom. When the old template dissolved, so did certain limitations. You were no longer confined to one path simply because it was routine. You could redesign aspects of your life with greater clarity. Normal had provided comfort, but it had also created complacency. Its absence sharpened awareness. You became more present, more intentional, more appreciative of simple experiences that once felt automatic. You stopped assuming tomorrow would look like yesterday. Instead, you prepared yourself to handle whatever shape it took. Stability was no longer something you expected from the world. It became something you cultivated within yourself. At some point, survival stopped being the goal. You crossed a line you didn't even notice at first. The days of barely holding on slowly transformed into days of calculated movement. You weren't just reacting anymore. You were anticipating. Observing patterns, understanding pressure, reading situations with sharper instincts. Something in you had shifted from defensive to strategic. You used to feel like you were trying to keep up, trying to manage chaos, trying to endure whatever came next. But endurance builds awareness. Awareness builds control. And control builds power, not loud, aggressive power, but composed, measured power. The kind that doesn't panic under stress because it has been trained by it. You began noticing that challenges didn't intimidate you the way they used to. Uncertainty no longer froze you. You had already navigated instability. You had already faced disruption. When new obstacles appeared, they felt familiar, not comfortable, but recognizable. And recognition removes shock. Without shock, there is clarity. Clarity changes posture. You carried yourself differently. Decisions became firmer. Boundaries became stronger. You stopped over-explaining yourself. You stopped seeking validation for every move. Pressure that once would have overwhelmed, you now felt like a signal to focus. You had learned how to operate when conditions weren't ideal. The fear that once dictated your reactions now became information instead of instruction. You could feel it without obeying it. You could analyze risk without surrendering to it. That emotional regulation is power. It means you're not controlled by every wave of anxiety or doubt. You evaluate, adjust, act. You also develop patience. Real strength isn't impulsive. It understands timing. It knows when to move and when to observe. After enduring prolonged uncertainty, you no longer rushed growth. You understood that sustainable progress is built deliberately. You became less reactive and more intentional. Your mindset hardened, not in cruelty, but in resilience. You stopped expecting the world to be easy. You stopped assuming fairness. Instead, you prepared for resistance. And preparation creates confidence. When you anticipate difficulty, it doesn't surprise you. When it doesn't surprise you, it doesn't dominate you. You realized something powerful. You can function under pressure. Many people only perform when conditions are perfect. You learn to execute when conditions are unpredictable. That ability separates participants from leaders. It separates those who wait for stability from those who create it. You also became more selective. About energy, about relationships, about commitments. Going through disruption clarifies priorities. You stopped entertaining distractions that don't align with growth. You became focused, efficient, disciplined. Not because you wanted control for its own sake, but because you understood the cost of chaos. Setbacks no longer felt like endings. They felt like levels, tests. Resistance meant to strengthen strategy. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening?" you asked, "How do I solve this?" That shift alone elevated you. Problem-solving replaced self-pity. Action replaced overthinking. Confidence built quietly, not from applause, not from public recognition, but from private victories. The days you didn't quit, the habits you maintained, the fears you confronted internally. Those invisible wins accumulated into a solid internal foundation. And now, when you step into challenges, you don't step in as someone hoping to survive. You step in as someone prepared to handle impact. You analyze weaknesses. You adapt quickly. You recover faster. You understand that growth is continuous and pressure is part of the process. The environment may still be unpredictable. The world may still shift without warning, but you are no longer fragile within it. You are conditioned, calibrated, strategic. You don't crumble when systems shake. You assess, reposition, advance. What once threatened to break you became the training ground that sharpened you. And the version of you that emerged isn't just resilient. It's formidable.